What's up, everyone? Thralls of Metal back again with another retro review, and this is one we are incredibly excited to bring you. I am, of course, Shredlord.
Necrotic Nick.
And the album I am talking about is Carnage, Dark Recollections.
This was essentially the starting point for one Michael Amott and his long career in metal, and this kind of came at like an interesting point in time, especially where it came out of. This was a Swedish death metal band formed in 1988, formed by Michael Amott and his buddy Johan Leva, both of which would end up an arch enemy. Now, the band only existed for 3 years, and they had lots of lineup changes. In fact, Michael was the only constant member throughout this entire band's cycle. Now, Leva was only in the band for the first year. In 1988, he played bass and did vocals. He was replaced by Matti Karki, who we know from Dismember. He was also in the band Carbonized at this time, and even done a little work with Therion. Now for a bassist, they got Johnny Dordevic, and their original drummer, Jeppe Larsson, I think that's how you pronounce his name.
It's the motherfucker.
It's the Swedish J, I assume it's the yeah sound. He was replaced by one Fred Esti, who Fred Esti was also in Dismember. Now, during this point, Dismember did exist. They were in a sort of period of hiatus, so they were sort of free to work around, and Michael Amott was sort of thrilled, especially to have Etsy in the band, because he was more of a death metal fan. Their earlier stuff was a little bit more towards the grind side. Their early demos, The Day Man Lost and Infestation of Evil, were definitely more grindy, though Infestation of Evil is where Etsy came in, and he brought in more death metal nuance since he was already a huge fan. This actually kind of came up as an interesting point because in Sweden, death metal hadn't really taken off yet. This came out in 1990, Dark Recollections. Now, literally that year in June, Entombed had just come out with their legendary album Left Hand Path, and it was still kind of gaining steam. Death metal was still kind of new. Thrash metal was still pretty much holding sway, except if you were in America, death metal had become a really cool budding scene with bands like Morbid Angel, Death, Deicide. All these bands were popping up and putting out really good stuff already, so Sweden had a lot of catching up to do. Now, rounding out the lineup for Dark Recollections was guitarist Dave Bloomquist, who joined on as the second guitarist. Now, his name is also familiar too because he is also in Dismember. And going through this, you found out that a lot of this album was stuff from the demos, sort of reworked, and then stuff that was demoed for Dismember. So they all kind of contributed to put this album together. And they were young, they were brash, they wanted to put out something heavy and just brutal as hell, but, you know, a little raw still. Actually, a lot raw, because you still had a lot of that grind influence, because grind was the big influence for Michael at this point. He was heavily influenced by Carcass, Napalm Death, and as well as bands like Repulsion and, of course, Morbid Angel later. But this album is pretty much like the ugly brother of Left Hand Path. It's a disgustingly heavy album, and it is loaded with murk, grime, filth, and riffs.
Yeah, the production is definitely murk and filth, but I believe for the capabilities of the time, it wasn't that bad, especially for a debut album from a bunch of chuckleheads who finally, you know, put the pieces together. But all those chuckleheads would end up becoming big old players in the game of metal, which is pretty fucking cool.
The production was actually done by Thomas Skogsberg, who is known for all of his work with the early Swedish death metal bands, namely Entombed, Dismember. I believe he did some stuff for Unleashed too. He was pretty much the Scott Burns of Sweden. And this was a very early production job for him. Like, literally, when Carnage came in the studio, Entombed had just left. So this was a very early production job for him. And he was like, oh my God, I got another bunch of crazies who want to do this ridiculously loud guitar tone. All right, let's do it. Now, opening up, you get the title track. And before you get to the actual song, you get these deranged synths. It sounds like they just let a cat walk across a keyboard, and then boom, you are into murky Swedish death metal. Like, the HM2 tone on this is just dirty sounding. Like,
I wonder if it was ran on the bass as well. The bass was very distorted.
Oh yeah.
Very distorted.
Everything about this is just steeped in filth. And almost to the point where sometimes the riffs can be indistinct, but when they are distinct, my God, they're good.
That was my only gripe about the production, really, is sometimes there's some lead guitar work that gets a little lost in the production just because of the way it sits in the mix. And then when the full band really gets going, the guitar seemed to take a back seat at times as far as like what your ear is hearing. The drums and the vocals are very much in the up front, and that's good, great, and dandy, but the heft of these riffs is really what makes this album pretty special. So I don't like to lose that in the mix.
No, and when they are at their best, when they are writing some more like nuanced stuff, because a lot of this stuff is just primal as hell, because you still get a lot of that crossover in the early grindcore, but Torn Apart and Malignant Epitaph, two giant standouts in here, mainly because you can hear a little bit more songwriting maturity, which is interesting because Torn Apart was actually on their second demo when Etsy had joined the band, and he definitely wanted to encourage them to write longer songs with more dynamics in it versus, the short grindy stuff. And wow, Torn Apart is Groove City, big heavy riffs, big breakdown chugs. The squealing leads just seem to cut through the mix on this. And the mix is, kind of uneven. Sometimes the lead tone is really squawky. Sometimes like, oh, that's really pretty. But it's kind of sitting back in the mix. Nasty vocal performance. And you get these really cool synths, which only really pop up here and maybe on a bit of one other track.
They pop in out of nowhere, just long enough for you to go, what the hell is that? And then they're gone. Like a fart in the wind, they vanish.
Yeah. But it's really cool how they're used, though. Like it really makes that moment heavier. Like it's just like the lowest possible, like this nasty low tone that just adds to the heft of the guitars and bass already. So kind of a cool use of synths there. It's just not something you hear on the rest of the album, but that one moment made heavier.
Another cool thing as a guitar player to listen to, as someone who's familiar with Michael Amott's work, in Carcass, Arch Enemy, it's interesting to hear him as a young guitar player because you hear a little bit of what would end up becoming really his signature style when it comes to like his leads. The riffs seem to have always been there.
Yes.
He's always had the riffs. The riffs have always been gifted to him. But these solos here on this album are more set up to be quick, and it seemed like in the beginning of the album they had more of the Slayer kind of feel, very quick, very chaotic, and always ending with a dive bomb that they just cranked on the tremolo, to get a really wide vibrato sound. But as the album progressed, the guitar seemed to get a little bit more adventurous. We got some harmonies. Towards the end, I believe we get a little bit of a tapping section. The
self-dissection, yeah.
The outro itself has a nice little descending guitar line itself. So it's very cool to kind of hear some of the early stylings of what would eventually become like his signature style, because if you're familiar with him and his playing, then he has a certain style to his riffs, and he definitely has a certain style to his leads. And it's cool to kind of hear the primal rawness before it was polished.
One thing I liked on this album, and it kind of popped up, and it's not something that pops up on a lot of Swedish death metal, is thrash metal riffs. Now, again, at this time, thrash metal was still pretty much king, but death metal was kind of a rising scene. And they kind of took maybe like a page out of the more thrashy death metal they're hearing from across the pond, Morbid Angel and Deicide. Torn Apart, once again, has some really, really cool thrashy riffs on it. And Blasphemies of the Flesh, too, also has some really distinct thrashy sections on it. It was pretty much like a whole hodgepodge of, all right, what is extreme, and what can we throw in here to make this even heavier? And, you got to kind of like take into consideration these were young kids. They were heavily influenced by some of the most raw acts they could find, and they wanted to make an impression right out of the gate. Now, it's interesting when it comes down to the production of this. These guys recorded this in about 5 days, pretty much working non-stop. So
that's a task.
Yeah, I think some of the exhaustion shows, and I think it shows on the vocals. First off, Matty does a great job. He does a fantastic job. His vocals are very appropriate for this. I mean, if you've been listening to Dismember as long as I have, you'll love the guy. He's got this great gravelly bellow, but sometimes on this you can tell he's a little bit off of the beat, and I don't know if that was just the exhaustion in there,
or they just ran out of time and takes. Because if you're up for 5 days, I have to imagine that's messing with your head awfully much.
You gotta give him like a moment to rest or throw up blood for a minute.
Now, two of my favorite songs actually happen to be back to back. and they would be Deranged from Blood and Malignant Epitaph. Now, what I like about Deranged from Blood is it has this kind of tremolo black metal riff that starts it, but it's done at a mid-tempo with these guitars kind of making this epic progression behind it. It gives it a very epic feel. It was a nice different flavor, so to speak. There's other tracks too that we didn't mention as far as like injecting influence. Doom. There's even maybe 5 to 7% of some Doom on here as well, which also adds to the, let's fucking summon Satan kind of vibe, which we love. And Malignant Epitaph shows me very carcassy, very carcassy right off the gate. A lot of melodic death metal touches here, and a great tune overall. The only complaint I really had is I wanted it to go a little bit longer. It was the shit. I was enjoying it. Those two especially stood out for me for a little bit different reasons, but once again, this is pre-Carcass. This is pre-Arch Enemy, so as a historian or someone who gets into that kind of stuff, once again, it's fun to hear the raw cracklings.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is one of the earliest Swedish death metal albums, so there was still like a lot of learning, and granted you had a great template with Entombed's Left Hand Path. This still had, a lot of work, but they had a lot of the hallmarks of it. You get tons of D-beat stomps, which, bring them. Give me those all day. I love those. The punky influence that's in there too. Just big, heavy punk moments on there, and something you don't hear in a lot of Swedish death metal are like blast beats, and there's a fair amount on here, but they're kind of like that straightforward, like napalm death blast beat, like the early Mick Harris style, like just beat the shit out of the kit and make it scream for you. And again, the fact that this was essentially Michael Amott taking the stuff that, he was working on in Carnage, and then Dismember throwing in their 2 cents in terms of stuff that was demos for them before they actually got together. You also have a song that was actually redone by Dismember. Death Evocation is actually re-recorded and thrown as a bonus track on Dismember's amazing debut album, Like an Ever-Flowing Stream. So this album is very interesting, especially when you consider the history. And we'll get to that, but first, we're going to rate it. Overall, I gotta give it 4 stars. It's rough. It's rough around the edges, but I love the intention. I even kind of like some of the mistakes in it because it just screams honest. Like, yeah, we goofed up, but I don't know, let's just keep rolling. And the riffs are golden. Like, this is not Left Hand Path, but this is a pretty solid offering in that style. And even the releases that would come out afterwards by Dismember, I still think are better than this. But this is really good. And it's raw, it's filthy, and it's exactly what death metal should be.
Overall, I'm going to give this a 3.5. This is some early awesome riffage from a guy that I would go on 90. I was 4 years old, so I really didn't know about much then, but I would go on to really adore this guy. So it is nice to hear his upbringing. There's a lot of great riffs on here. There's a lot of creativity on here. The writing's a little basic, but that's because it's their first shot. But there's a lot of promise and a lot of good stuff on here, regardless of any flaws that it may have due to time constraints, production, blah, blah, blah. This is really a gem of an album, and if you are a fan of any of these bands, be it Carcass, Arch Enemy, Dismember, then I would absolutely recommend that you give this a listen because it is a lot of fun. Even the sound effects that make their way in every once in a while, it almost gives it like a B-movie kind of feel at times.
Dude, every now and then you get like a super distorted vocal line from Maddie, and somehow it's even heavier. Like, oh wow, that's campy as shit.
But it works.
But I love it.
Yeah, it works. And it's stuff like that that really made this a fun listen. So 3.5 all day long, all day strong, and check it out if you haven't, please.
So as for what happened in this band and sort of the history here, they pretty much dissolved not too long after this was recorded. Now, they literally entered the studio after Entombed, pretty much bullet trained the production, and I imagine they were kind of exhausted. I don't even know if they really got to do much touring and playing on this. But I didn't bring that up before because I think it's more relevant now to the story. This album was originally released on Necrosis Records, which was a subsidiary of Earache Records, and was run by one Jeff Walker and one Bill Steer. Now, when Jeff Walker had actually come to the studio to pick up the master tapes, at that point he was looking to expand Carcass's sound. They were kind of tired of just being the gross grindcore band. I was like, well, we want to be gross, but we want to be a little bit more sophisticated. and we were thinking about adding another guitarist. And he actually approached Michael Amott, and Michael Amott jumped at the chance because one of the main reasons they got into this was because of Carcass. He was a giant fan. So he ended up doing 3 legendary albums with Carcass. Now, the rest of the band essentially went on to form Dismember. They pretty much just like, well, the Carnage thing's done. You want to just get Dismember back? And then Dismember has this long, awesome career being one of the most influential bands in Swedish death metal. So this is essentially kind of another Dismember demo and Michael Amott's audition for the Carcass job, if you really want to break it down that way. So yeah, short-lived band, one nasty release, but honestly, and even as Michael Amott said, they're kind of more famous for what came after. You know, this is a fun one-off, but the fact that it's splintered off and, you know, essentially researched Dismember and then Carcass got even more incredible. I don't know, it kind of makes it this little fun little, like, kind of blip on the death metal radar.
So, that brings us to the end, boys and girls. If you like what you saw here, please hit the like, and if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. We would greatly appreciate it. It also lets you know when we put out new content, which is pretty much on the daily. Also, there is a link below to Patreon if you would like to support us knuckleheads in the form of a Patreon subscription, which we add cool little exclusive content to. Once again, we would greatly appreciate it. And also, if you have not already donned yourself your Thralls of Metal shirt, then gosh darn it, you need to. If you just go ahead and email thrallsofmetal@gmail.com with the description shirts in large letters.
We're blind.
Yeah, we're blind from years of masturbating. I mean, staring at TV screens.
Yes, that's it.
That's it. You send us the size, we'll send you the invoice, and we will get you hooked up. So, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Timex. It takes a licking and keeps on ticking.